Hello to everyone watching, and welcome to the 21st Annual 6th International SF Virtual Conference and the panel discussion on recent trends in Indian science fiction and South Asian fiction. We have for you today a very eminent panel which will give you a broad overview of what Indian science fiction is all about, what the recent trends are, how it's evolved and how it's evolving, and hopefully you will go back with a whole list of books and stories to read for starters, and a lot of food for thought as well. Before we get into the panel discussion proper, could I ask the panelists to briefly introduce themselves, starting with Dr. Singh?
Hello and greetings, everybody. My thanks to the organizers for inviting me. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here. I write science fiction and sometimes fantasy, and have some small experience editing, but I also think a lot about science fiction, particularly Indian science fiction. I'm also a scholar of climate change and a professor of physics.
Dr. Banerjee?
Hello, everyone. I'm Superno Banerjee, and I'm also very happy to be here. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me today. I'm a professor of English at Texas State University. I read a lot of science fiction and fantasy too, and my interest has for a long time been Indian science fiction, and I'm a scholar of the topic and write articles about it rather than stories. So I look at it from an analytical perspective.
Mr. Charak?
Hi, everyone. Dinker Charak. By profession, I'm a product manager. That means I create products, and I've created products in many arenas. One of the domain which I've enjoyed most making products has been high energy physics. I have worked at Fermilab, I have worked at CERN, and I consider myself a storyteller who, in search of a place where I could tell my story, ended up creating Adbhut.in. I've recently released a collection of my short stories called Neutrinos Are Coming. Really happy and really honored to be part of this group, and looking forward to the discussion.
Yes, Mr. Bardan.
Hello, everybody, and I thank again the organizations, the organizers, for inviting me to this panel discussion, and Mr. Shenoy for agreeing to moderate this and lead this discussions. I also thank the other panelists for being here. A quick introduction about myself. Actually, my introduction to science fiction started pretty early and at a very young age. My uncle, whose name is pretty familiar in the science fiction world, when it comes to regional science fiction, was Bardan, and he started a magazine called Fantastic. I mean, he had started first a magazine called Ascharya, but then I was really born. But when he restarted Fantastic, I started writing a few stories here and there. And that's how got my interest in science fiction. I've been very an avid reader of science fiction, even if I did not keep writing for quite a long time. And then I again picked up this writing hobby maybe about 5-6 years back when the Kalpavishnu magazine came in, and it was almost accidental because I have been a great believer that science fiction should move away from adventure stories into world building and creating narratives about issues. And there was a raging debate going on in a group that probably this could not be done in regional language. So I sort of took this up as a challenge. I tried to see if I could write something, and the result was a book on which based on steampunk, probably the first ever steampunk written in Bengali, which got a little of reader attention, and that hooked onto me onto knowing more about steampunk. So I sometimes started writing about it. I also review. I mean, one of the first reviews was actually Dr.Superno Banerjee's book on science fiction. I did a review for that in Scroll. You can find it there. And recently I published an article on the history of steampunk also on Scroll. So I write, I review, I do some amount of things. And I am also a very strong enthusiast about science fiction, the genre itself, and to understand how it is moving and how it should move and how we can move forward and not get stuck in a single aspect of science fiction, because as a domain, science fiction is very vast. I think that about sums about myself. So Mr. Shenoy, and then we can probably start the discussion.
Yes. So the topic for today's discussion is recent trends in Indian SF and South Asian SF. Just to give you a background of Indian SF, the popular perception is that Indian science fiction does not exist, at least amongst the mainstream audience, but that could not be further than the truth. We have a history of science fiction or rather speculative fiction going back to about 150 years, even if you discount the fact that all the myths and all that are, categorized as myth and not as fantastic literature. Starting from 1845, the Dutt brothers who wrote the time travel stories, right down to Jagdish Chandra Bose's Nirudeshir Kahini in 1896. The story of the missing one, which was perhaps the first science fiction story in the world to use, the butterfly effect as a literary device. Then, for example, we had in 1905, Begum Rokeya Hossain's Sultana's Dream, which is amongst the very first feminist science fiction stories anywhere in the world. It's a dream narrative, and that happened in 1905. Right, and after that, of course, given the state of the country, the independence struggle, we didn't have much time to, people didn't have much time to indulge in speculative fiction. But then post-independence, a lot of Indian science fiction survived in our regional languages. These are the languages that kept this genre alive and took it to the people when stories in English were very few and far between. So we had a lot of stories. I mean, Bengali, of course, Marathi, of course, with Dr. Narlikar and Bal Phonke and all those luminaries. In Bengali with Adrish Bardan and Satyajit Ray and Premendra Mitra and all of these people. I'm just naming a very few. There's so many more. In Kannada, there were a lot of people like Dr. Racheka Busnurmat, and being a Kannadiga myself, probably it would be right to point out here that in 1928, much before the so-called US Golden Age, Dr. Shivaram Karanth, who was a Sahitya Academy winner, an artist, a folk artist, a writer, he wrote this story called Pashubala, which talks about interplanetary travel and first contact, and a device called a Tejo Bhashaka litophone, right, which sort of brings to mind the Le Guin's device, right, the Ansible, decades before she wrote about it. So there are these little hidden gems that we ourselves don't know about, and the more you dig, the more you see that there's so much history. And then fast forward to the late 20th, early 21st, and then we had writers like Dr. Singh, taking our stories, writing stories set in India, which speak to Indian culture, which speak to it, and taking it to the world. You had the first Indian fantasy novel in English, which was Sumit Basu's Simokan Prophecies. And from there, we had Ruchir Joshi's The Last Jet Engine Laugh, right? And as you move forward, then more and more books kept happening. In the last 2-3 years, it's been quite well for Indian science fiction, in the sense that lots of the young authors have emerged and have found worldwide acclaim. They've been nominated for the Nebulas, they've been nominated for the Hugos, they've been nominated. Their books like Lavanya Lakshminarayan's Analog Virtual, Gautham Bhatia's The Wall and the Horizon, Samit Basu's Chosen Spirits, have all made it to the Locus recommended list, which is, one of the most followed lists across the world. And lots of short story. I mean, science fiction is a genre that thrives in the short fiction format. And lots of short stories have also been nominated for all these awards, and some of them have even gone on to win. So that's where we are at right now. That's a brief history of Indian thing. And of course, when you say South Asian science fiction, we also include Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, which have had a lot of young authors coming. For example, from Sri Lanka, we have authors like Yudhanjay Vijayaratne, who's come in, who's written books like Number Caste and about the perils of what shall we say, social credits, storing, sort of algorithmically enforced caste systems. He's written other books as well, including the Colombo trilogy, which is an alternative history. Then there's Naveen Veeraratne from Sri Lanka. Then there's Vajra Chandrasekhara from Bangladesh. We have Sajjad Hussain, who's writing a lot of books in his Jinverse. Then from Pakistan, we have someone like Usman T. Malik. And if you look at the Golan's book of South Asian science fiction, volume 1 and volume 2, this is the first time Golan's was publishing in India. And both these volumes, especially the second one, gives you quite the overview of the young emerging talent, which is there, as well as established names. So I'll stop now, and I'd like to just sit back and listen to Dr. Banerjee, right? Because before we see what the recent trends are, as they say, you'll know where you are once you know where you're coming from. And Dr. Banerjee's book, to me, was sort of very eye-opening. It's called Indian Science Fiction Patterns, History, and Hybridity. It's a very scholarly study which draws upon a lot of things like post-colonial theory, science fiction criticism, genre theory, philosophy, and history to sort of chart the evolutionary trends and the larger arcs of Indian science fiction. So, Dr. Banerjee, if you could, you've done such a deep study of the genre of Indian SF, and you are a science fiction fan at heart. So, how have you seen it evolve till today, and what are the larger arcs, evolutionary arcs that you have seen? Could you just tell us?
Sure, I would try to, because as you rightly pointed out right now, it's more than 150 years of history, and it's very difficult to concentrate into small chunk. But I agree with you. Like you mentioned, the initial developments and the recent trends. One thing that I've noticed, and from 1835, and I stopped at 2019, when I had to submit the manuscript. Is a very interesting interaction with Western science fiction and Western culture. So that was one of my arguments, the hybridity part. I think it's not only limited to that, obviously, there are other things going on. But I keep on seeing an interesting relationship between Indian science fiction and Western science fiction. And I find most interesting the emergence in the 19th century. Obviously, we have a lot more works come up in the early 20th century, and since the middle of the 20th century, it's been it's a slow but steady growth. And we are now seeing, and I completely agree with your characterization, that we are seeing a lot of works across the languages, which is very, very important. So if I have to quickly say a few things, I tend to see, if we want to designate something or specify something as science fiction, and I obviously don't want to genre box it, because I know there are lots of cross generic interaction all through literary products. I tend to see it emerging in 1835 as an interaction between the British education system and the Indian society in K.C. Dutt's Journal of the 1945. Okay, as a sort of millennial utopian, not futuristic, millennial utopian tale that imagines a rebellion against the British. So that's that is a radical break from the current situation. So that's something I find very interesting. And specifically because if you think about Macaulay's doctrine that we should create a group of people who would be given English education because they want a middle class or middlemen who will rule the rest of the people for us. And then that was 1835. And this little story comes out in English language the same year, which imagines kicking the British out of the country. That's a wonderful irony for me. And if you go forward, you mentioned 1845, the next story, which actually imagines kicking the British out of India and creating Republic of Orissa. So that is a wonderful beginning. And I think it was with Dr. Singh that Anil Menon was having a conversation at some point much earlier when Anil Menon said Indian science fiction is it's a product out of alien interaction or something along that line. And then the aliens are the British here. So I find that very, very interesting. And if you look at the middle of the 19th century, when we start actually seeing science fiction coming out in indigenous languages such as Bengali and Hindi, we see another very interesting interaction, because the first three texts coming out of Bangla are all in a way products of this new colonial science education. So 1882, we have Himlal Datta's Rahosyo, translates as mystery, which is all about gadgets. This guy has gone to study in England, and he's invited over to a friend's house who has these various gadgets that he has invented and is harassed by gadgets. So Western science creates gadgets that harasses this native guy who has gone to study in England. So that's probably the first indigenous language SF coming out of India. And then obviously you mentioned Jagadish Chandra Bose or Jagadananda Ray's Shukra Bhaman, first interplanetary science fiction, also a dream vision in a sense. All of these are coming out of science education and its relationship to society. When I was looking at the Hindi text coming out of this time period, I see another interesting interaction. I think many of the scholars in Hindi, including Sukhdev Prasad, who had this wonderful anthology of Indian science fiction translated from various languages in Hindi, he mentions that, and not only he, but I have seen some other Hindi scholars mention that Pandit Ambika Datta Vyasa's Ashcharya Vrittan that comes out in 1884 has, and I have seen similarities with Jules Verne's Journey to the Center of the Earth. Okay, although it has distinct Indian cultural elements in there as well. And in 1900, we have Kesab Prasad Singh's Chandralokhi Yatra in Hindi, which some has mentioned linked to Jules Verne's Journey to the From Earth to the Moon, but I see more connection with Hans Pfaall by Edgar Allan Poe, American Edgar Allan Poe, because the protagonist in this story is named Hans Pfaall. And they try to go to the moon in a balloon. So you see, like that is another interaction with Western culture, Western science fiction, in this case, popular literature. So if we are looking at the beginning to get a historical perspective, we either see English education system or the colonial scientific education or interaction with Western text, obviously through English language. So that provided me as a basis of thinking, let's see what's happening later. And we see a lot of translation at the turn of the century too, of Jules Verne, Arthur Conan Doyle, H.G. Wells, and many stories that are in that vein. So even if you look at 1920s, 1910s, we also see magazine cultures developing, not SF magazine culture, but children's magazine, young adult magazines. And we see science fictions being written in those. published in those. Sandesh is a important, I think, name to mention. Started by Sukumar Rai, Sukumar Rai and Upendra Kishore Rai Chaudhuri, Satyajit Ray's father and grandfather. And we have many others. So Premendra Mitra, you mentioned, he starts writing stories in magazines in 1930s. And Hemendra Kumar Roy, who is, I think, one of the early icons of pop culture, who wrote science fiction, genre science fiction, regularly from the 1920s onwards in Bengali, and so on and so forth. And so the way I see it, and that's how I kind of mentioned that in my book, is a first sort of development in the 19th century, which shows direct influence of the British education system. And in the first half of 20th century, we see slow consolidation, and we have other languages which starts producing science fiction. I think Marathi starts producing science fiction early 20th century. There are a couple Assamese stories that comes out, and there may be others. So there's so many, obviously you cannot dig everything out there. But there's slow consolidation in popular literature, along with such things as detective fiction, mystery, so on and so forth, like cousin genres together, adventure fiction. R.L. Stevenson is again a big influence here, I think. But we also have similar utopian narratives, like you mentioned, Begum Rokea's feminist utopia. But we also have Rahul Sankritan's 22%, which is, I think, one of the first utopian reactions to the Soviet Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 outside of Russia, which is, I think, very, very important thing to remember. And that gives us, that specific story is also very fascinating to me, because it kind of shows a third alternative between the British rule, the Gandhian movement of independence, and this is sort of presenting a communist avenue of imagining new independent India in a completely different manner. So I find this development fascinating, the way, various ways that these are developing, and in various different languages, not only in English or Bengali, but in Hindi, in Marathi, I think we start seeing in Assamese, and you also mentioned in Kannada, right? So there are so many things coming up, and obviously, like you mentioned, in the 1950s, we see. I also think of it as a golden age of indigenous language science fiction, because there are so many other languages which starts producing SF during this period, and we have a strong magazine culture developing, and obviously, as Sumit mentioned, Adrish Bardan is a major presence in this context. He probably was engaged with 3 different magazines, right, Sumit? Ashcharya, Fantastic, and there was another one, right? You are muted.
You're on mute.
I'm sorry there. No, the first magazine started by Adrish Bardan was Ashcharya. That was somewhere around 66.
63.
Or, yeah, 63. Yeah. And then he later restarted Fantastic. There was a third magazine called Bishmoy,
Right.
but that was done by Ronen Ghosh, not Adrish Bardan. But Ronen Ghosh and Adrish Bardan had earlier worked together on Fantastic. So after Fantastic sort of whittled down or closed down or quieted down, Ronen Ghosh started Bishmoy.
Right. And I've seen like similar, I've come across similar accounts. Obviously, the Marathi Vidyan Parishad has done a wonderful job during this time, right? Popularizing science, doing these science fiction contests, which obviously pushed the genre in Marathi. That probably Marathi had the biggest presence since the middle of the century, other than probably Hindi and Bengali science fiction. One thing that I've noticed towards the end of this 20th century, maybe a rising awareness of other science fiction traditions amongst the various different language communities, which I probably don't think existed earlier. And I think that that book that Balkonke edited, It Happened Tomorrow, is a very important thing that to think about, because it brought together science fiction from various different languages, although it kind of is dominated by Marathi writers, but it still brought in many writers from various regions. So that's a very, very important thing to think about, which I think creates a presence of science fiction as a genre at the national level. So we can think in terms of Indian science fiction. Earlier, we were thinking about, okay, an author here, an author there, a Bengali author, a Kannada author, a Tamil author, a Hindi author. But here we are kind of trying to think about it as a kind of larger presence across the languages. The fourth period that I think about or formulated here, again, all of these are, I constantly say that I'm just trying to scratch the surface here. I don't think anybody can do more than that, more than scratch the surface here. If you're thinking about at least 10 or 15 languages having science fiction traditions and then thinking about it, I see from the 1990s onwards, Indian science fiction's slow exposure, international exposure. So obviously earlier, Satyajit Ray, Premendra Mitra, Jayant Narlikar had international exposure, but that was not a common thing, I think, rather exception. But as from the 1990s, I see 1995 as an important year because of the publication of Calcutta Chromosome, which drew a lot of attention to Indian science fiction, and then Manjula Padmanabhan's Harvest, and both of these texts won awards in 1997. Padmanabhan won the Onassis Award, and obviously Amitav Ghosh won the Arthur C. Clarke Award. So that kind of draws attention, international attention, and then obviously we have wonderful new writers coming into the field and internationalizing it. Dr. Singh, Rimi Chatterjee, and Anil Menon, and there are so many more authors starts coming in, and I start seeing it as an opening up, very important opening up of Indian science fiction to the world. The thing that we are obviously noticing here is that regional language science fiction exists, but English is the language, internationally read language. So we are talking about authors who are writing in English. And web magazine culture again kind of comes in, I think. Vigyan Katha starts publishing in Hindi science fiction regularly. And later on, Kalpa Bishwa and Mithila Review are very, very important presence in them. It starts from 2016, I think. So if you're looking at these, and I'm probably stop here because we have more or less kind of reached our present, and all of us can talk about it. I think that has created a historical perspective, at least the trends. I think from 1995 or so onwards, we have reached a stage where Indian SF is being internationalized, not only in the creative sphere, but the scholarly sphere as well. Mostly from the 2010s, we are seeing across the academic community, SF studies community, publication on Indian writing, Indian science fiction. And in the last 3 years, there have been 5 books, including mine. One was just published, I think, last month, an anthology. So these are very important developments, and I hope that creates sort of a context for us to move on to other topics.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to sort of pick, and there's a lot of food for thought in there. And if you just sort of deep dive, we'll be here till tomorrow morning, and
maybe longer.
But thank you, Dr. Banerjee, for that brief. This one, I mean, those little arcs, and I totally buy the fact that post 1995, the reason the exposure has happened is primarily because there's been so much Indian science fiction writing in English. Right, but at the same time, it's also sort of had, as a reader, I can say that it's sort of had a trickle down effect in terms of lots of our regional languages getting translated into English, because now the world knows that, okay, listen, there's this wealth of this thing. I mean, we can only hope that more and more of those would get published. Like just recently, Dr. Arvind Mishra's Hindi science fiction stories were translated and published as The Space Cuckoo and other stories. And what this has also done is sort of build a community of readers, who are willing to support all of this. And someone who's seen this community from close by, from multiple perspectives, as a writer, as an editor, as a critic and a commentator, has been Dr. Singh, who's I think been writing quite actively from in the last 20 years, right from the early part of this century. So you've seen this whole Indian SF, getting internationalized from a small, sort of nascent form to where it is today. And you've had a big role to play in it, as an editor, as a writer, and as a popularizer of Indian SF. So Dr. Singh, could you just take us through your journey and your experiences on how you've seen this landscape change and how it's evolved and what you see are the larger trends? And if you could also speak a bit about your speculative manifesto, which I first read in your collection, The One Who Thought She Was a Planet, and I found it quite mind expanding in terms of giving you a different perspective of of looking at science fiction as a genre and what it can do. So over to you, Dr. Singh.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Superno, to Dr. Banerjee, for that beautiful exposition of the history of Indian SF. First, I want to say that I'm really not an expert on Indian science fiction or literary traditions, and I have very little editing experience. So my only expertise is in my own experience as a writer. So I'm going to speak from that perspective and what I've seen. So it's a very personal view. And essentially, as an Indian expat in the US who is permanently homesick, I started to see, being away from your home shores, you start to see not only the world you're in as this strange place where everything is different, the switches go the other way, the grass looks different, all of that. But you also start looking back at your home and seeing it for the first time, in a sense, right? And the only genre that I could find that made sense to me to describe that sense of I don't know, whatever you'd call it. The literary critics have terms for these things. The only genre was science fiction. Now, I had read science fiction before as a child. I had read Clarke and Asimov to begin with, but even before that, there used to be these lovely little lurid little Hind pocket books in Hindi that happily mixed science fiction and fantasy, and they were these tall tales. So I guess I had a receptive mind, but it was extremely isolating at that time because the only Indian science fiction writer I knew about was Jayant Narlikar. I had read some of his short stories as a teenager growing up in Delhi, in magazines. And I didn't know the rich history of our own traditions. So I was sort of writing in a vacuum and trying to make sense of what this sense of alienation meant to me, where I felt disconnected in space and time from both the place I was in and the place of my origins. Now, what was really interesting, because I literally, felt like an alien, and that's a very interesting and strange feeling, to feel like an alien. So when I started writing science fiction, and I actually wrote, believe it or not, a young adult science fiction novel, which has never seen the light of day, and that's probably a good thing. But then I got into short stories. I found, reactions by fellow American science fiction writers at that time, and I'm talking about the late 1990s, early 2000s, which indicated to me a lack of familiarity, a prevalence of stereotypes, and a lack of familiarity with the idea of Indian SF. In fact, the very first writers' conference I went to as a newbie who had never published a thing, I was told by, I'm trying to remember if she was an editor or an agent, a literary agent, and she told me, why are you writing science fiction? You should be writing about arranged marriages and saris and things like that. And I was just taken aback and outraged, So anyway, so long story short, I started to attend some science fiction conventions. So the science fiction fan scene is big in the US, and it's very interesting to see how engaged readers are with the authors and their works. So and when I did, I was actually not only the only Indian or the only South Asian, but I was, apart from one great writer of African-American science fiction, Samuel Delany, I was the only non-white person in among 500 people. Now, if you go to the same science fiction convention, you'll see plenty of African-American writers. You'll also see writers from South Asia, and you'll see writers from other countries as well. And also recently, the Italian writer and anthologist Francesco Verso has started Future SF, which is an international science fiction convention. So you get to interact with writers from Argentina or Brazil or China or wherever. So it's a very exciting time now to be a writer. The first time I met another Indian science fiction writer was Anil Menon, and this was at a World Science Fiction Convention in Boston. And I remember him coming after a panel where I was on the panel, and he was introduced by someone else. And I thought, oh my gosh, I've found a brother finally, because it is very lonely to feel like you're the only person. So gradually, as I met more emerging science fiction writers from South Asia, it felt like finally I could not only react to Western science fiction, right back to Western science fiction, but also be influenced by my own people. And I'll mention one last example of that is when translations started to happen. That's when I discovered that there was a rich history of Indian science fiction. The first translation I read was a collection of short stories by Premendra Mitra, and it blew me away. And I had this decolonizing moment where it was like, I can actually talk to my own people. How incredible is that? So for that, I'm very, very grateful to Regional SF. And I think that those of us who have the privilege to be writing in English and in touch with, international science fiction, simply because English is the language of global privilege, I think that we also have a responsibility to recognize and acknowledge regional science fiction and its importance. So I'll stop there.
No, I mean, indeed, the importance of regional SF, our native languages cannot be understated. Like I said, they were ones who kept the genre alive for so long when there was hardly an English story. The reader, I mean, it appeared in magazines, not science fiction magazines like perhaps it happened in Bengal, but in Karnataka, it happened in your regular, weekly magazines and all of that. So Tamil, has a history, right? And now Dr. Nele S. Muthu and all of those people are still writing. Assamese has, Dr. Dinesh Chandra Goswami. So there are lots of these things. I mean, for me personally, it's like a gold mine waiting to be discovered. And in that, I am just as much as a alien as somebody who's not from India, because I can't read Bengali, right? I can't understand Assamese. So, I think once the translations really start in right earnest, and that's perhaps the need of the day, and that's something that I want to see as a trend going forward, is a lot more translations to English from our own regional languages, which brings me to Mr. Bardan, who was carrying forward a very rich legacy of science fiction in Bengali, right? And that's one, for example, Bengal is blessed because they have a publisher, for example, called like Kalpa Biswa, right? They're not just bringing out the old classics back, they're also publishing new stories. They're doing translations into Bengali and working to translate some of the Bengali classics into English. So, Mr. Bardan, if you could talk about, your experience as a writer and the wealth of stories in regional languages, and your experience with Kalpa Biswa and how important an outlet like this is for Indian SF so far.
Thank you, Mr. Shenoy. Just taking on from where you left it, the importance of English translations so that regional SF can have a broader audience. Let me start with that trend. Now we see some of the young writers who write in Bengali actually have become bilingual. So they are writing both in Bengali as well as English. And some of their English writings are also getting published in non-Indian magazines or webzines outside India. So that's a very encouraging trend. Some of us understand the criticality of translations and are looking forward to find out how our stories can be taken to a broader audience, and trying to find avenues for doing that. I, for example, have started translating my own stories. I may have shared one of those. I started smaller stories, and in fact, one of the novels I'm trying to explore now if I can translate it myself. So that's one trend. Now coming to the richness and what is going on, since Dr. Superno Banerjee has already covered a period to 2019, and let me take on from what I've seen from that period onwards to today. So let's talk about the last 5 or 6 years, especially from when Kalpa Biswa came into picture. Now, one advantage of being a webzine is that you can actually have the bandwidth or the breadth to allow a lot of new writers to come in. You can experiment with a lot of form and content and structure without having too much to bother about the structures or the confines in which a print magazine operates, because you are not bound by those limitations of costs and a particular reader segment. Now, this has actually brought in a lot of new writers, and it has brought in a lot of enthusiasm to experiment. Now, if you see the period before Kalpa Biswa, and from when I got into writing, the Bengali SF has been fighting against 2.5 countercurrents. The first countercurrent is that science fiction is not really quote unquote literature. It is something fanciful, something on the borderline. That's one countercurrent. A second countercurrent is that science fiction is basically children's literature. It's meant for children, and it has been traditionally published mostly by the children's magazine. And because of the countercurrent two, you have another half a countercurrent. Since you're writing for children and you basically use it as a vehicle for education, so science fiction means a lot of science and with some amount of fiction around. Now, these 2.5 countercurrents did is to basically restrict the genre within a very narrow confine, because science fiction is much broader. Now, if you look at the definitions of science fiction, it's a minefield to tread on. But still, if you look at one of these, and I'm very fond of that particular definition, is one given by Alexey and Corey Panshin in their 1995 book, Over the Hill, Quest for Transcendence, science fiction, the Quest for Transcendence. The book won, I think, a Hugo Award in 1995. And to cut it very short, they called science fiction as literature of mythic imagination. So there are 3 terms over here. First of all, it's a literature. Then there is imagination. And then there is mythic. So it's not only imagination, it is a imagination of mythological proportions. And their contention is that humankind always needed storytellers. And the first storytellers were the people who created mythologies. And what is a mythology? A mythology is a story which tells about the current constant, and then paints a picture outside the known confines of a geography, maybe over that hill, or across that sea, or across some deep inside the forest. And if somebody could manage to make that magical journey, he could come back with something which would change the world. So you have, King Arthur going and pulling out the sword from the stone, or Arjuna doing a tapasya and going all the way to the Himalayas to get the Pashupatastra. Now, these are the quest of the heroes. Now, this has been in all cultures, in all histories, this you see this very common phenomenon. Now, most of these mythologies, when they were painting a journey, they depended on magic, gods, supernatural beings. Now, when the age of reason came in, from probably 300 years ago, people started losing faith in these magic and spiritual beings and gods and goddesses and demons. The world became short. So Ulysses had no place to go to fight the Cyclops, because we knew that we had mapped the ocean. There was no Cyclops to kill. There was no golden fleece to get back. All the mountains had been crossed. All the oceans had been traversed. So mythology lost its charm. But mythology is required. All of us would like to hear a very optimistic story. We would like to know that beyond these confines, which is restricting us, there's something bigger, something broader waiting for us. Should we be willing to take the trouble? And so science fiction became a vehicle for this storytelling or this mythology. And what those barriers were in one era, they were the seas and the mountains, now became intergalactic distances. They became time travel. They became the ability to conquer death, the ability to replicate yourself on a computer or another machine. Now, I think this is a very beautiful example because it allows us to now explore science fiction, beyond the confines of just fiction with a lot of science for education children. So 2016 onwards, when we saw Kalpapiswa coming, a lot of people have started experimenting. For example, take the young writer Soham Guha. He is a bilingual writer. He writes both in English as well as in Bengali. He is one of his stories, I think, was included in the South Asian anthology. And he has been probably one of the first writers to heavily write on climate change. Both Soham and then another young writer, Soumya, they have been writing and stories which involve indigenous people and their concerns. I mean, what happens when you take away the forests, or when you take an elephant and then implant one neural net inside its head and then start making them into toys. Then there has been efforts to by some women writers to even talk about artificial intelligence and how social media is using artificial intelligence to sort of mold us or to train us or to do something. So these new trends have started coming. People have been fighting against these cross currents to write a whole lot of new stories with a different form, different content, different structure. And if I can share my experience, I started this journey by trying to bring in steampunk into Bengali science fiction. Steampunk was not, even the word was not known. We had to literally write a few lines explaining to people what steampunk was, because nobody had any before. Even you could launch the book and tell, here's a book which uses steampunk. I have tried doing things like I retold Shakespeare's Tempest in a steampunk setting and retold the story. I have taken a form of 19th century Bengali, which is, it's not spoken, the dialect is forgotten, and tried to write science fiction in that. And I've tried to, impute multitextuality in my writings by getting the Martians from H.G. Wells, invading India. I have taken Japanese literature. For example, one of the stories I wrote was based on Kurosawa's very famous movie Rashomon, which was the story was based on the Japanese short story writer, who is probably the father of Japanese short stories, Ryunosuke Akutagawa. Had two stories, and based on that, Kurosawa had made a film called Rashomon. And the premise of the stories was that the truth is indeterminate. If you call something has happened and you call 4 people or 5 people as witnesses, depending on their own bias, they'll give you a completely different version of the story. So I thought that was a very good narrative in the days of post-truth, where we have multiple narratives of a same event, and you will get multiple versions depending on whom you are listening to or which channel you are tuned to. So I wrote a Bengali-sized version, a science fiction version. I transplanted the entire cast into a different planet, and I wrote a story. And continuing that, I created a story called based on Yachi Okamoto's Sword of Doom. I rewrote that, added as a prequel, and reinterpreted. I created a novel. So I have been experimenting with multiple structures, multiple forms, bringing in multiple storylines from multiple cultures, just to counter that thought that, again within quote unquote, that science fiction is children's literature, because these people are not writing for children. Tempest was not written for children. Tempest was a very layered story, which talked a lot of things like colonization, of being trapped in a situation that somebody did not want. And I recreated in a steampunk setting. So multiple experiments have gone in, multiple experiments are going in, both by junior writers, by senior writers. I would like to mention a very senior writer, Debajyoti Bhattacharya, and he wrote a story which about a world where the women had not only become second-class citizens, they become actually property. Now, these are very warning bells that sounded by some of the writings as how the world may not be a better place the way we are progressing. So climate change, gender issues, the threat of technologies that we do not understand, like AI and social media, talks, stories about indigenous people. We recently had one book published by a writer called Ronin. His pen name is his name is Gautham, and he wrote a fiction about a game world. And the book was written about a game world, and he included a board game along with the book, which is the very first in Bengal. I don't think it has been done before. So his story was that, being implanted in the game world and then playing along with the game. So various kind of structures and formats are being taken from the West. Earlier, the stories were only taken. We took the stories and probably retold it or probably just translated it. Now I'm seeing forms, structures, content, and various experiments are happening. What I can say is the recent trends are having a webzine gives you the freedom of not being afraid to experiment. Because you are not, they do not have a editor telling you, my friend, this is science fiction, and if you want to write science fiction, this is how you write, you should write. I mean, just to give an anecdotal story, I'll not take any names. One young writer had written a story on science fiction, and then he had sent it to a print magazine, and the magazine for teenagers. And he got a reply back, see, it's a magazine for teenagers. Your story doesn't have any love angle in that. So please put it in. Unless you put that inside, we cannot print it. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately, whatever, when you're writing for a webzine like that, you are not concerned by anything, because you're writing science fiction. So provided writing is good and you're writing something new, you're not plagiarized, you have something new to say, as a writer, your skills are up to the mark, it is readable, it is enjoyable. I think the magazine will print it, because there is no print run, there is no length of pages, nobody's telling you story has to be maximum this many words and minimum those many words. We can only take X amount of stories. Sorry, friend, the story is great, but we already accepted 10 hour. So we are not bound by those constraints. So I think, as you said, Carl, having a webzine to write for has been a little boom. I can speak for myself. It has allowed me to just experiment with abandon as if there is no tomorrow.
Okay. And thank you, Dr. Vandana. And someone who knows about this very intimately is Mr. Charak, who started Adbhut.in, and he calls it, Adbhut, an Indian experience. So the focus is very clearly English, and him being a science fiction fan and a writer himself, so he knows. I'm sure. I'd like to hear from him how he's probably never forced a science fiction writer to put romance or love in his stories, because one thing that Indian SF, I think, probably needs to grow further is a very vibrant and community, right, of readers and and outlets to take these stories, and which is where something like Adbhut comes in. I mean, we have a Mithila review, we have a Kalpa Biswa, right? But we also need more and more of them, which is where I think Adbhut comes in, because it's a one-stop for stories, reviews, updates, and news. So, Mr. Charak, if you could tell me, how did Adbhut come to be, and what's your experience with that has been with Indian SF, and how has it changed over the years? Your submissions, your outlook, your editorial policies, perhaps. Yeah, over to you.
Sure. Thanks for that setting up that context. So I want to, I'll restrict my conversation here to the Adbhut experience. And this kind of started in 2001. And as I was reading science fiction, and one of the things which I started noticing is that the fans own the genre in US. Thanks to the Big Bang Theory, a lot of people across the world are understanding the power that fans had over how comic books came into picture, and how the fans really drove and appreciated and really took control of how the science fiction is growing. And when I started reading around, this is around 2001, I'm myself new in US, and I started noticing that the kind of stories people are trying to talk about in US is primarily coming from their immigrant experience. And Dr. Singh kind of alluded to that, how her experience of being an immigrant started shaping the desire to come out with something creative. So I thought, okay, let's create something. And the first problem that I hit was that what's an Indian, right? Sci-fi. And, take the safe route. If you feel it's an Indian, I am okay with it. So just come up, show up, claim it, and start publishing. And wanted to do something in English in every language. And this is 2001 to the next problem I faced was fonts, right? This is before Unicode is so pervasive today. We don't even realize how the world was before that on web. I mean, I would write something, put something on a web page in Hindi, and maybe using Akshar font, and someone else who does not have it installed on their desktop suddenly sees boxes with question marks in it. I'm getting emails that I can't read anything. And as this is going, right, there's this technology barrier that we're trying to cross. There is this, the boxing or unboxing of what we're trying to do. Yes, there is something unique about the Indian experience, but Indian experience is not the geographic India, right? I myself was no longer in geographic India at that moment. The kind of stories that people were coming at, you could make out, right? Someone had once said, I'll know it once I see it, right? They were referring to something else. But once you read it, okay, this is Indian science fiction, could have been written by anyone. And a clear pattern was kind of emerging in early days. Those who are based out of US, this is a website, it's easy to submit. People are very free to express. They're little impatient to get their story out. They're very impatient to tell their story. Probably they don't have the time to write the whole novel or go to a publisher. So we used to get a lot of these, I used to call them like outbursts of creativity, right? Immigrant experience and stuff coming out of India, relying on rich heritage of India, right? So mythology, maybe some variant of it, something getting inspired by it. And over the years, I have been kind of hoping that some interesting takes come up, which are very unique to Indian thinking. And at least in the submissions that we are getting. And at that time, M. Night Shyamalan started coming into a picture, and one of his books, one of his movies actually, The Sign, I was watching it with a grad who had just been accepted to West Point, which is a very famous military school, college in US. In India, we have it Dehradun. So we're watching this movie. This fellow is going to go into army soon, right? And I'm watching. And if you have seen that movie, they defeat aliens. It's an alien invasion. They defeat aliens. Not a single gun, not a single bullet, minimal violence, and they defeat aliens. And this, it struck to me that, M. Night Shyamalan, he's an American Indian. In a recent interview with Singh, who's another very popular American Indian, he's talking about how his movies were informed, or how they were shaped up by his heritage, his mother and grandmother doing puja at home and doing all these things, very sari, and him trying to kind of run away from it, but not able to run away from his heritage. And how different was his treatment to sci-fi, right? And that was a very interesting, a moment, to borrow Dr. Singh's phrase, decolonized my mind, that, there is something very interesting in how we do it. And as that is happening, right, I myself was involved in a physics domain. I was working very closely with physicists, and I found it very easy to reach out. So in India, we have Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar Award given to scientists in different fields, physics, biology. And what I started doing was, okay, along with the stories, let's start putting these interviews, knowing these people beyond their work, asking them about what kind of things they like. But the change was that over years, that became very difficult to do, because as the institutions formalized, and a few years back, I reached out to a couple of the winners. They said, our institute doesn't allow us to talk to press. I said, I'm not a press, I'm like a website. They said, no, you'll have to go through the PR. Very few people were able to talk about it. But anyway, that aside, one thing that, also changed, and I'm seeing that trend happening a lot, is self-publishing coming up a lot. I see that as an extension of the way people were responding to Adbhut. This is a safe place, if I can use that phrase, where I can just publish without any editor coming and saying, what bakwas, what is this? So this is not properly written, fix your English. There was this whole mindset of a lot of writers at that time, like how not to get rejected. And I was talking to some folks in forums, personal life, right? I used to feel very frustrated that the first, you're writing something and your focus is how not to get rejected, right? Because Kalpo Biswa has done something really good for Bengali literature, but in India, if you look at it, there aren't really analogous today, and self-publishing really opened up that door. So you see a lot of experimenting happening, people writing a lot of books. We are part of some forums where every so often everyone is coming up and saying, hey, I published it. A lot of them are self-published. So that has opened up a new opportunity for people to come. And in those places, I'm seeing that the expected trend of an Indian author, talk about saris and arranged marriage, loves and all those things. People are not really feeling, they're just going bold. Yes, there are those themes, there are mythology-based themes, there are total out of the scratch themes, right? Not everyone is winning awards, not everyone is getting in the locus, but we need to have, this long tail of creative mass coming in, which will give this push for few to rise and reach that prominence of the level of Asimov and Clark and Locust recommendations. We need this mass. We need this mass to thrive, feel confident, and create that, critical top set of, mass of topics for people to talk about. One of the things that we are trying to experiment now is, I was very influenced. I'm forgetting the name of this person, but there was a very famous Native American Hollywood actor who made this claim that writing is an colonizing act. We have a tradition of telling stories. And when you force me to write my story, you have stolen away my culture. You're forcing this new culture on top of me. And he kind of wrote this essay. He didn't write it. He said, I think he was on a deathbed. I'll look for it, maybe share it in comments for other readers. I'm narrating this, and you who's writing it down is writing it because you want to get it published. And that kind of reminded me of Vedvyas and Ganesh, right? Vedvyas said, I'm not going to write it. I'm just going to narrate it. If you want others to know, you sit and write it down, right? So we are experimenting in Adbhut now. What can we do to bring this oral tradition back? And I'm trying it with some sci-fi authors. Just narrate the story to me. Don't read it. Just tell me the story. And one thing that, for example, it's impossible for me to write Bengali, but because some family members are Bengalis, right, I can kind of understand it. And if someone was telling me a story in Bengali, it's more accessible to me. It's a much less cultural learning curve for me to hear something and pick it up. So one of the experiments we're trying to do is, can we, through YouTube channel, do these oral narration, this oral storytelling, bring it to sci-fi? Because while you folks were talking about these awesome authors who have written books, all through my mind, I was going through, my grandmother had creative mind. She used to tell me these stories. Every gathering, all the friends will get drunk, and there are three parts to it, right? So first is context setting. What, last time I got drunk, this friend started driving and had a weird encounter with a ghost. That's context. And then you tell the story, and in the end part, there's always this legend setting, this myth setting. That's why you should not get drunk on full moon night. These kind of statements, right? And this has been happening in oral tradition all the time, but somehow it's getting lost. It's not getting recorded. The academics are unable to have access to it, to study it and create formal, body of knowledge out of it. So that's one experiment we are trying to do. So the last thing that I want to say is that one of the things I was hoping to happen hasn't happened is when the moon, ISRO's landing was unsuccessful and it crashed on the moon. It crashed on the dark side of the moon, and I was hoping that we will see this surge of conspiracy theories of, see, we told you there are aliens, and now people out of India are going to come up with these stories. What happened? Like, right from those conspiracy stories to maybe some new set of sci-fi coming out of India that, maybe there were people inside it and they were up to something. I don't know. I was hoping that, because if you look at it in US, the moon landing and all these space missions, and if you hear to every author who followed it said that inspired us. Maybe that is happening. It just not reached us yet. Maybe there are kids, there are students, maybe people who are participating in this conference, the scholars and students who are listening to this, who are thinking about this, right? Whose mind has changed, who is thinking that maybe Mars mission, Mangalyaan shouldn't just be a biopic which is stating the fact and the struggles, but let's take the Mangalyaan and totally think something sci-fi out of it. I'm expecting that kind of content to come out. I'm really expecting, eagerly waiting for all that to happen. The pop culture treatment of it, the conspiracy culture treatment of it. Let's see what comes out of it. And finally, I'm hoping, like how Comic Cons allows readers to participate, like, you get these awesome creators of comic books elevating it to the level of graphic novels, and people are going and talking to them. I'm hoping there is sci-fi con being planned. Maybe Adbhut should do it. I don't know how to do it. Maybe with some support, we'll be able to do it, where all the authors are in front of the people who have made their literature what it is today, and hearing both positive feedback, and all the readers are really feeling that we are part of this equation. It's not a bullet theory. It's not someone has written it and then I have to read it. It is, we are equal participants in this creation. So let's see how that goes. So I know my time is up, so I'll try to summarize by saying a lot of experimenting happening. Very happy to hear Sumit ji talk about experimenting and the freedom it's giving. I'm very happy that others are also thinking like this. Let's see how things go.
Yes, I mean, yeah, the thing about the con, I'm really kicked about. Actually, for 2 years, the Bangalore Literature Festival actually had a dedicated SF track. So in the first year, there was Bruce Sterling, Samit Basu, and Krishnauday Shankar who was there. In the second year, we had Ian McDonald, Indra Pramit Das, Yudhanjay Vijayaratne, Naveen Veeraratne, Vinayak Verma, Sukanya Venkatragavan, all part of the SF track. I curated it. So kudos to them for taking that step. I hope other literature festivals take it on too, if not a full-blown only SF con, writers and readers, like you said, Mr. Charak. So yeah, so the trends that I see emerging are, I mean, there is a lot of fresh young writers with new talent who have exposure and access to new avenues, and that Indian SF is in a good place right now, right? Even in regional languages, with their magazines and with their translations being going on. So without speaking too much, could I just ask each of you to give quick, very brief, concluding remarks about what's that one trend that you would like to see in Indian SF, right? That one trend, or one or two trends that you would like to see in Indian SF in the coming days, months, and years. Quick remarks, please, starting with you. We'll go in the order that we went in, starting with you, Dr. Banerjee.
All right. Well, again, that's a difficult question to think about because there are many things I would like to see, but most probably what I would like to see is translations in various directions, not only from regional languages to English, but translation from one region language to another, maybe first into English and then disseminated amongst the other languages. So sort of what NBT was doing, National Book Trust was doing earlier, something like It Happened Tomorrow, which was translated into English first and then translated into other regional languages. Because I see these last 10-15 years as some sort of a resurrection, or maybe not resurrection, but a new push towards making SF something of a mainstream. So if we don't do that, we still might have these silos, which Mr. Charak was talking about earlier. We don't really know other language, so many languages. There are so many languages in India, it's impossible to know them. So these cross-cultural, cross-linguistic interactions, I think, is necessary if we want to see SF thriving in India, not only within specific silos, but across them. So translations in both directions, from regional languages into English, because we know that English is a language read all over the world, hence gives more exposure, but also within languages, because many people don't read English for entertainment in India. That's a fact.
No, absolutely, absolutely.
So that's and the second point is that I would like to see is more scholarship, which I again am very happy to see that's happening in the last few years. Lots of scholarship, because it creates critical mass, which draws attention again in the mainstream of scholarship in India as well as outside it. So that's my 2 points. Those are two of my points.
Very valid. Dr. Singh?
Well, I think I'm going to quickly talk about 3 things I'd like to see. And some of them are related to what Sumit said and what also Dr. Banerjee said. I would love to see Indian SF writers in any language interact with each other more across language differences, across geographical regions, and also be influenced and interact with and potentially influence not just Western writers in the West, but non-Western writers. So Sumit mentioned, Japanese, the influence of Kurosawa and all of that. And I think that would be really a wonderful thing. And for that requires community, building community, with people who are involved with SF, either as readers or writers or whatever, so I would love to see community building around this and influence across linguistic and other regional boundaries. Then I do want to pick up on what Mr. Charak said about oral storytelling, because that's one direction that I'm really, I also have fond memories of my grandmother and my mother telling me stories. And I think we really miss out on that aspect, because the audience is important. There's no complete story without an audience. And that's an experimental direction which I'm going. So I'd love to see more of a return to that. And the last thing I want to say is that what I'd really like to see is science fiction that is looking seriously at the challenges we face today and looking critically at science and technology. And I say this as somebody who is from the sciences, because we are facing major global and national problems. There's problems of climate change and growing inequality within nations, growing authoritarianism, and all of those things. So I think we need serious engagement with those issues in order to broaden our imaginations. So I'll stop there.
Mr. Bardan? You're on mute. You're on mute.
Sorry there. I think I will, sort of start with where Madam Vandana Singh left. I think it's very important. First of all, a trend I'd like to see is to for science fiction to start addressing issues which have a lot of context and which are very relevant. I mean, if we have to make science fiction mainstream and appeal to the mainstream audience, we should be writing more stories which are relevant. And the relevance comes from the looming threat of danger from multiple sources, climate change, technological misuse, our ability to even understand the technology that we're using. And here I'll just take a little to elaborate on myself. Even 30, 40 years back, all the technology somebody used, we broadly understand what we're using. Today, none of us understand, have the faintest clue of how things around us work. And having come from even from a technical background, I can say today, none of us know how this meeting is going on. The phones that we hold in our hands, we do not know how it operates. The machines that we are going to use or will be using from 20, 30 years from now, we'll have no clue who built them, how they're built, and along with the advantages they give us, what are the baggage we are allowing inside our homes. So these are certain threats that I think we need to warn people of. That my rest trends, I will agree with, again, Dr. Banerjee, that we require translations, not from regional language to English, but also from regional language to regional language. Kalpa Biswa, I think, recently published a Bengali translation of Hindi science fiction. Okay, and we have, from my own experience, we can say that there are enough number of bilingual people in the country, people who come from one language tradition, have to spend their childhood, or do have family members who come from multiple language traditions. We should take their help and then translate from one language to another directly, because once you go via English, a lot of flavor is lost because of the nature of the English language and because of certain of the cultural barriers that language cannot cross. And thirdly, again, I will agree that both the other speakers, that we need a lot of interaction, community. We need a community of speakers across languages speaking to each other's maybe in such forums like this, in regular, if not physical meeting is possible, at least virtual meetings for writers to interact with each other and share their experiences, share their directions, as well as a very important thing, at least virtually meet and interact with the readers to understand what they want, what they're looking for, and then take us in that direction. Thank you. I think this concludes the three trends that I'd like to see.
Thank you, Mr. Bardan. Mr. Charak, what do you say?
Yeah, I'll take, I want to compliment what Dr. Singh and Mr. Bardan said. I want more science fiction coming out of India, which is so mind expanding that the science fiction has no context in our today's reality. It is something that helps us envision something that today we cannot even imagine. I want that kind of mind expanding also coming in order, along with the Black Mirror version of how things could go wrong where we are if we are not careful. So that's one, things that we cannot even imagine coming onto us. And second one, more sci-fi as YouTube shorts. Sure.
All right, thank you all. That was quite the illuminating discussion for me as well, to so many different perspectives, so many different things, and I'm sure the listeners also would go back with a lot of food for thought and tons of little notes to go back and chew on. So thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Banerjee, Dr. Singh, Mr. Bardan, and Mr. Charak for agreeing to be on the panel and for sharing your views with us. Once again, I'd like to thank IASFS and all the organizing members and the institutions that have supported this con and are hosting this panel discussion. So on that note, thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to the listeners also. Thank you. Namaskar.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. And I must say that I'm a great admirer of both Sumit Bardan's and Vandana Singh's writing. So I'm really, really glad to be part of this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.